Hello everybody and welcome back to the Science Museum here in London, and this is the Aviation Show, brought to you as always by the fabulous Pima Aerospace Museum, and it's time to talk about this remarkable airplane with the man who has literally written the book on it. David Rooney, hello, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Exceptionally well, thank you.
Super. We of course have chatted about the big hop on the 15-minute book club, but we're going to give you a bit longer than 15 minutes today because your association with this aircraft, 31 years, you were saying earlier. Why is that? What did you used to do here, sir?
I joined this place as a Science Museum trainee in 1995, 31 years ago. I was just finishing a physics degree and thinking about my future. Managed to get a job as a trainee. September 95, first day in the office, and I was taken around the Science Museum by my new colleagues. This is where you're going to be working from now on. This is your office. And of all of the halls and galleries and exhibitions that I saw that day, of course, we came in here to the Aeronautics Gallery. And can you just imagine my feelings as I just turned 21, walking in the door and seeing this aircraft hangar full of the dream of flight made real. Colleagues took me around, and as you can see, in the middle of the gallery is this huge Vickers First World War biplane, and they said this is the aeroplane that was the first to fly the Atlantic. What, that? I mean, it's made of fabric. There's a bit of steel in there as well, but it's fabric and timber, open-topped cockpit. And from then on, that story started to lodge itself in my heart. 30 years later, I got a chance to tell it in much more depth than you would normally in a museum caption, and the big hop is the result.
Yes, because there's quite a few more than 50 words on a panel in this one. So let's just set the scene, really. What story does the big hop tell? Because it's not just about this Vickers Vimy, is it?
It's not. I mean, it starts with that. It's the story of the first non-stop flight across the Atlantic, which took place in 1919 in this aeroplane by two guys, John Alcock, known as Jack, Arthur Whitten Brown, known as Ted. And that's where the story starts, is this famous flight. But as soon as you start to unpick that, why were they flying across the Atlantic? What was going on in 1919, in the spring of 1919? Who else was involved? And it sort of grows and grows and grows, and it turns into not just a single flight, but a competition and then a race. Other competing teams and other great names in the history of aviation, not just the pilots and the navigators, but the engineers and the dope specialists and the fabric sewers and all of that. The people who funded it, the people who promoted it. It's such a rich story that we've kind of forgotten, I think.
Yes. We'll come back to probably the people that overshadow it a little bit later. Yeah. But let's start with the aircraft. We're going to come to the competition in a minute, because this aircraft, this type of aircraft, should we say, represents a sea change in the air war in the First World War, doesn't it? With the advent of, I'm going to use air quotes, the heavy bomber of its time. With this, the Handley Page, the Gothas, things like this. This is a foreshadowing of what's going to come 20 years later, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, there were heavy bombers before the Vimy and the big four-engine Handley Pages. There was the two-engine Handley Pages, the O series, O100s and 400s. They'd been flying long-distance bombing flights for a year or two by 1917, when the Vimy was first commissioned, and others. It was German air raids on London in 1917 in the spring, which caused that sea change, and the Air Ministry decided to commission these heavy bombers that could fly from Essex, basically, to Berlin and bomb Berlin. Now, the Vimy and the Handley Page and others weren't finished ready by the end of the war, so they were never put to their intended use. But they're really a crystallization of all of the steep development in aviation that had taken place in the First World War and in the years before, to the extent that they were actually very sophisticated aircraft, which would become the nascent airliners of the post-war period. In fact, the Vimy would become the Vimy Commercial one of the most successful in the 1920s.
So let's just go through its vital statistics. Biplane, 2 Rolls-Royce Eagle engines of which I have an unhealthy obsession with the story behind them, because this is Rolls-Royce's first Aero engine. It's a cracker, but it needed a bit of help to get developed, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Rolls-Royce didn't want to get into the Aero engine game. They were very happy making motor cars and motor car engines. But really, I mean, one of the biggest challenges in the air war and the First World War was engines, of course.
Which, of course, we are standing next to the fabulous engine collection here in the Science Museum as well.
I mean, anyone who can get to visit the Science Museum to the Aeronautics Gallery must come here. It really is an astonishing collection. Those early engines were capricious. They were unreliable. They gulped oil and fuel. And it was rare to find an engine in the First World War that would run for more than a few hours before needing a complete rebuild. So the idea of either a long-distance bomber or a cross-Atlantic flight that might last 20 hours meant that there were so few engines around that could do that. The Rolls-Royce Eagle, which was commissioned effectively by the British government to try and solve that problem, to make a British engine that was half decent, led to the Eagle, which is sort of the origin story of the whole Rolls-Royce Aero engine account. But, you know, there's a certain amount of, I mean, one wouldn't say industrial espionage, but there's a certain amount of...
underhanded tactics.
Look, we were at war.
They stole a Mercedes Grand Prix car to get the Aero engine out of that. Well, W.O. Bentley stole a Mercedes-Benz Grand Prix car. Let's just cut to the chase.
I think the car just stayed in the UK for longer than it might have expected.
And it was put to good use.
It was. I mean, when you think about everything that followed, not just by Rolls-Royce, of course, by all the Aero engine makers, after the Eagle and the Falcon and other ones like it, and then the success story of British Aero engine making to the present is astonishing. And aided in no small part by the fame that the engines got outside of the aviation community, I think, by flights like the first flight across the Atlantic. Because I mean, bearing in mind that when Alcock and Brown, I mean, spoiler alert, they managed to they succeeded and landed. We'll come to that.
Yeah, you've just sort of ruined the end of the book, really.
I do apologise. But they were very clear in their kind of speeches when they succeeded to say that it was Vickers and the people of Vickers who'd made the airframe, but it was also Rolls-Royce who'd made engines which they trusted implicitly. They were very, very clear that it was Rolls-Royce that they owed their survival to.
Let's talk about the 2 pilots, because their story before that flight is utterly fascinating. So Jack Alcock, Ted Brown. We'll start with Ted, because his name always comes second in this, because he's an American, isn't he?
Yeah. Well, he's Anglo-American. His father was from Schenectady, moved to Pittsburgh to work for Herman Westinghouse, met his wife-to-be, Emma Whitten, a Pittsburgh native, worked with Herman Westinghouse of the famous Westinghouse organisation on compact steam engines and other kind of fairly heavy engineering. And the couple were in Scotland, in Glasgow, in 1886 on a scoping trip for some new developments that Westinghouse were interested in bringing to Britain. And while they were in Glasgow on this business trip, Arthur Whitten Brown, Ted Brown as he took the name, was born. So he was an American citizen, born to American parents, but born in Britain. And they never went back.
As my wonderful wife Wendy is holding the camera and is a proud Scotswoman, so Ted Brown's really a Scotsman, not an American.
It's very interesting, and he himself said that he struggled to know what his identity was, and he talked about his own accent, that he didn't pick up he said, a Pittsburgh accent, a Scots accent, a Manchester accent, because the family moved to Manchester when he was a kid. He was very much a transatlantic guy who straddled the Atlantic. He had a foot in Pittsburgh. They would often go back to visit family and friends there. He wasn't in Scotland for long. His Manchester identity was very clear. He wasn't an aviator to begin with. He was an engineer. He worked for Westinghouse in Britain, the huge Trafford Park Westinghouse factory in Manchester. Ended up as a mining engineer and then an electrical engineer. And that job allowed him to travel in ways which few other Manchester residents could at that time. He would work in America for the parent company. He worked in Africa. He worked for a year in South Africa, setting up mining equipment for the gold and diamond mines in Johannesburg. He worked in Wales, in Pontypridd. He was very much a cosmopolitan engineer, which made what happened to him in the First World War actually all the more tragic, really.
Before we talk about his service, let's talk about Jack.
Yeah.
Because utterly fascinating character in his own right. You've got Ted, cosmopolitan, travelled. What was Jack's story?
Yeah,
where was he from?
It's really interesting. And in some ways you can see Alcock and Brown as two very, very contrasting characters. They had some, in terms of their temperament, in terms of their background and all of that, and yet they got on incredibly well, which was the reason for their success. Jack Alcock, born a little bit younger than Ted, he was born in 1892 in Manchester, in South Manchester. The most humble working class origins. His father was a coachman, his mother served drinks and cleaned rooms in a Manchester pub. They moved around the northwest a little bit as a kid, but basically he spent most of his life in Manchester. Ended up as a garage mechanic in a backstreet garage in Manchester, working on motorcar engines and motorbike engines. And he got that job at the age of 16. But the garage owner had the ambition to be the first person in Manchester to fly. And that guy, Charlie Fletcher, set up a consortium to build Manchester's first aeroplane and fly it. And Jack was involved in the project. And in 1909 in Heaton Park, which is a park still there in Manchester, they flew. I mean, it was a hop. It was an undignified landing. But can you imagine what it must have been like to be a kid from Manchester, to help build an aeroplane in 1909, just 1 year after the first flight in Britain, just a few years after the first flight ever, and to be involved in a project which sees an aeroplane get off the ground in Heaton Park? We've wanted to fly for thousands of years, to be with the gods, to be with the birds. And there he'd done it. He was hooked. And he became obsessed with flight, got a delivery job to go to Brooklands to take an Aero engine to Brooklands in Surrey, where British aviation started, you could argue, along with Farnborough and other places. And he never left. He got a job there. He spent the rest of his teens there, learned to fly there, and was there when the war broke out in 1914.
It's fascinating that through Jack Alcock, in this gallery we go, his connection to the first flight in Manchester. We've got Aviation aircraft over there, the Cody aircraft. Just within this gallery, and 3 aircraft next to each other, and one of the men who flew this one, you have that line right back to the birth of aviation in the UK.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what sort of wars did they have? Because I think all of the men who end up in Newfoundland in 1919 are affected by their war experience. What happened to Jack and Ted during the war?
They all were affected by the war experience, but I think it's fair to say none more so than Alcock and Brown, Jack and Ted. I don't want to give too much away because I don't want to give too many spoilers from the story.
It's a fascinating section of your book because it's not just about the flight, it's about everything that leads to it.
It's not, because to understand what they did in 1919, just a few months after the war ended, you have to understand their war and everything that came before it. So I talk a lot about their teenage years at Brooklands before the war, growing up together as friends. But in the war, it's fair to say that both Alcock and Brown had bad wars. They started off well in both cases. Jack Alcock joined the Royal Naval Air Service, which was the naval wing of military flying, and was already such a good pilot by then that he wasn't sent to fight. He was sent to train pilots in Eastchurch. So he spent the first 2.5 years of the war in Eastchurch training pilots. He had had enough. He believed his contribution to the war and to the future of Britain was to fight, not to teach. So he petitioned for a posting, and he ended up in Mudros in the Aegean theatre, and he performed some very important flights on the heavy bombers of the day, the earlier Handley Page twin-engine bombers. I'll not say what happened, but suffice to say it didn't end well for him. Arthur Whitten Brown, Ted Brown on the other hand, started the war as a private in the British Army. He said he was an American citizen. He didn't have to join up, but he said he wasn't prepared to wait until his country entered the war. He was going to join up. So he joined up in 1914, served in the trenches in Ypres and on the Somme, wandered a way out of that and joined the Royal Flying Corps, which was the Army aviation wing, as an artillery spotter, as an observer at the front of the Royal Aircraft Factory BE-2C aircraft, which were
not great airplanes.
They were fantastically stable aeroplanes that would fly straight with, I mean, it was hands-off flying. You would just keep flying straight, but if you're in a dogfight, that's the worst thing you could possibly have. And so as an observer at the front of one of those, the pilot sat behind, he was in the worst position for what happened to him twice. He was shot down once and landed on the Allied side of the lines, and later was shot down again. And I'll not say what happened to him after that, but it was really hard for the rest of the war for him. So when both Alcock and Brown came to the end of the war, when the armistice was signed in the end of 1918, they'd both had a difficult experience, and they were both out of a job. And like so many other aviators, engineers, and all the rest, they were looking for what the future might hold. And then they found it.
Through a lot of British leaps in aviation, there is one gentleman putting up aviation prizes. And who was that man, and what was his newspaper?
Alfred Harmsworth, who founded the Daily Mail in 1896, who really is of incalculable importance in the development of British aviation. Not just British aviation, but world aviation, because his prizes weren't just for British aviators, they were for anybody. He, as so many others did, heard about the first flights in Europe in 1906, when Alberto Santos Dumont flew his little aeroplane around the Eiffel Tower in front of the public, 3 years after the Wright brothers had made their secret flights in Kitty Hawk. So 1906 was when the public started to cotton on to the idea that flying was powered flight, heavier than air flight was now possible. And the next day after that flight, he said to his editor, England is no longer an island, because he realized that now the aeroplane had flown, this what was described as the wooden wall that protected Britain, and the safety moat around it, the channel and the oceans, could just be stepped over by an aviator. So he started putting money into the development of aviation as a means of fighting back. And he put big money into the first flight to Manchester and back. This was before anyone had ever flown in Britain. The first flight across the Channel, circuit races of Britain, and so on. And what he was always doing was to put money into projects which there was no chance of them being met at the time, because he wanted to sponsor research and development in the only way he knew how, which was not to convince the government, who were reluctant to get involved, but just to put the money and let them get on with it.
Again, this is where that story is fantastic. So we have a Blériot at one end, which famously won the Trans-Channel Prize. And in the middle, you've got the winner of the £10,000 that he put up in 1913 to fly the Atlantic, which you think is wild, because nothing could fly anywhere near that far in 1913. And he's saying transatlantic is the next big hop, which, funnily enough, you put on the title of your book.
Absolutely, and one journalist who saw Blériot fly the Channel in 1909 said that he was a monoplane, that it looked like the skeleton of a huge bluebottle fly. You know, let's remember in 1909 what aircraft were. They really were rudimentary affairs with these capricious engines made of fabric and sticks of spruce. Could carry one or at the most two people. Only a year after anyone had flown an aeroplane in Britain, and only 3 after anyone had flown in Europe. and then just 4 years later, for Lord Northcliffe, as he was by then, to put up £10,000 to fly the Atlantic. Sounds crazy, and it was crazy because he knew nobody could do it then, but he wanted to. We didn't know that war would break out. But actually, it wasn't that crazy. There were two very serious contenders for the prize by 1914. The Glenn Curtiss company in America and Martinsyde in the UK were quite far advanced with their plans, with an aeroplane and with pilots. Now, the war intervened, and then the acceleration of aviation development because of the war meant that when the contest was back on in 1919, it would be things like this, or the Handley Pages, or even the smaller single engines that Sopwith were turning out, or Martinsyde themselves, that actually had a fighting chance of making it across.
Let's go downstairs so we can have a little bit of a closer look and we can see what Vickers did to the Vimy to get it ready. We can talk a little bit about the fun and games in Newfoundland. We're saying Newfoundland specifically because as a Canadian, it wasn't Canada yet, dear viewer, and that doesn't happen for another 30 years. But that's another story for another video, another time. Let's head downstairs, shall we?
Let's do it.
The Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona is home to one of the largest non-government funded aviation and space museums in the world. Featuring nearly 400 aircraft, the museum is home to an incredible collection like NASA's NB-52 X-15 dropship and 747 SP Sophia Airborne Observatory, to a wealth of rare military types from air forces all around the world, to the first production 777 and the second prototype 787 Dreamliner. Whether you're a military or civilian aviation geek, there will be an incredible aircraft around every corner of this epic 80-acre site for you to explore. As the Aviation Show's partnership with the Pima Air and Space Museum enters its third year, we're delighted to say that Pima is truly a top of your bucket list museum to visit. And it keeps getting better because the Philippine Mars is now on display, and right across the car park, the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum's doors are wide open to welcome you in to check out an amazing collection of tanks, armored fighting vehicles, and other vehicles if you get fed up with all the airplanes. To find out more about the incredible collection and the fantastic events coming up at the Pima Air and Space Museum, and of course the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum, head over to www.pimaair.org to plan your trip to one of the world's great aviation collections, and one that now includes tanks next door, if that's your sort of thing. We get to 1919, 4 teams arrive in Newfoundland for it. Who have we got vying for? Dear viewer, I know in the comments somebody's going to say that the US Navy are doing their thing a bit further south. It's in the book, but we're not going to talk about that here. Fascinating story, but we're going to stick to the 4 British teams. Who were they?
It's interesting to think about why Newfoundland in the first place. Why would anyone fly from Newfoundland to the west coast of Ireland? Because when you look at the geography of Newfoundland, it really is the worst place on Earth.
It's a beautiful place on Earth.
Utterly beautiful, rugged, rocky, with cliffs and mountains and bogs and ruts and ditches. The worst possible place to imagine taking an aircraft off from, but Newfoundland to Ireland is the shortest distance across the North Atlantic, and the winds prevail going from west to east, which was about 45 miles an hour at 2,000 feet, so it was really significant to save fuel, which at the time was very important. So anyone who wanted to win Lord Northcliffe's £10,000 cash would need to get their aeroplane to Newfoundland to fly it to Ireland. And as you say, 4 teams did, and Vickers was very much the last to the party. So it started in March 1919 when Sopwith first arrived, led by the famous Harry Hawker, who absolutely intended to be first to fly across in a single-engine aircraft, smaller than the Vimy, quite a lot smaller, not tiny, with the Rolls-Royce Eagle again. Second to arrive, a name that's less remembered perhaps in aviation history, which is Martinsyde, which made some of the best aircraft of the First World War, had been involved in a plan to fly the Atlantic in 1913, 1914, when the prize was first put up, led by a guy called Fred Raynham, who I think is a really interesting character in the book, and it was a joy to get to know him through the historical record. The third to arrive was Handley Page, very much the outlier in their very big 4-engine heavy V1500 bomber, one of the Berlin bombers even bigger than the Vickers Vimy, led by an admiral in his 50s, Mark Kerr. And then the scrappy young team from Vickers turned up later on in the Vimy.
Which is weird, because we say scrappy young team from Vickers. Vickers is a huge company by this point. It's probably easy to say what they don't make, but very famously, Bayat Maxim produced the famous Vickers machine gun, and then just about everything else that you can possibly think of.
I mean, one of those big engineering conglomerates, armaments, shipbuilding, armour plating for ships. But they got into the aviation game a little bit later than some, around about 1911, started making aircraft in near London, set up a training school, a flight training school at Brooklands, 1912, set up a factory, a second aircraft factory in Brooklands, 1914-15. So by the time that 1919 came, they'd been training pilots, they'd been making some fantastic aeroplanes, but we've got to remember what had happened to the aviation industry the night that the armistice was signed at the end of 1918, and Tom Sopwith said it as best as anyone. He said it was a turning off of the tap. It wasn't a case of running down the industry. It was turning off the tap, and he had to make something like 2/3 or 3/4 of his workforce redundant overnight. The market had dropped out of aviation. Nobody was buying aeroplanes. Orders were cancelled. Any that had been built but not delivered would sit idle in the works. And who knew who would buy aeroplanes? Because civil aviation did not exist at this point. Who would ever imagine that aeroplanes would be used to transport passengers and mail and cargo when they had hitherto just been a war weapon, and before that, a kind of enthusiast's pastime? So Vickers, yes, I said that they were scrappy. They were a small team by that point, contracted against their will, who wanted to expand again and develop civil aviation. How do you do that? Well, if you can be the first to fly something that might look like what would become an airliner, to be first across the Atlantic, well, you might just save your business and potentially the entire industry.
So what do they do to take a quite long-range bomber anyways and make it suitable for flying the Atlantic? And we have half the canvas removed to show kind of what they did.
It's such a joy always to be in this gallery. I mean, I grew up walking underneath the wings of this. Yeah, already a long-range heavy bomber, and effectively what the conversion involved, which was carried out at Brooklands over just a few weeks in 1919,
Let's swap sides so you can actually point better at...
Was effectively to remove weight, to remove armaments, and to replace bomb bays and bomb-dropping equipment with fuel tanks and oil tanks. So because the Science Museum, right from the start, had the side of the fuselage removed, so you can see that. You can see these huge fuel tanks. It was something like 3 times the fuel capacity from as a heavy bomber to as a transatlantic machine. Something like 300 gallons as a bomber, about 900 gallons, just shy of that, of petrol in this configuration. So you can see the tanks there. Additional oil tanks for the engines as well, additional tanks kind of secreted about the place. It's interesting to note, I think, isn't it, that most of the fuselage is actually empty. The trim was a real challenge. If you've got this much gasoline being burned through a 16 or 20 hour flight, if you've got fuel all the way around to the back, then the trim, the nose forward aspect of that is going to be very significant. So by keeping the tanks sort of forward, it reduced that problem. Even so, Jack Alcock had a real problem on his hands. I'm jumping forward slightly. There's an elastic device to try and take some of the pressure off his arms and legs for most of the flight, but that had been fitted wrongly, so he had to bear all of the weight of the control surfaces by himself. So the guns were taken off and the gun aiming equipment, and what you're left with is this 2-seat, twin-engine flying fuel tank. Very compact cockpit, side by side, Alcock sitting on the right and Brown sitting on the left. And it's fabric and spruce and some tubular steel at the front. And that's it. Fly the Atlantic.
So, well, I so want to talk about hawkers. I want to talk about the guys at Martinsyde. Handley Page, I'm not really fussed. They're a bit up themselves. Anyways, they have to build airfields in Newfoundland. The weather turns against everybody. There's crashes, false starts, shenanigans, shall we say.
We shall.
And it gets to the point where the weather's breaking, there is an opportunity. How do the Vickers team get going? Because, okay, we have to say, they're not the first to depart, are we?
They are not the first to depart.
As
They're
a
not the
hawker
first to get off the ground.
Harry was first, but we won't. Do we want to say no? We won't.
I think we can certainly say that Harry Hawker and Matt Grieve, his navigator, in a Sopwith, got off the ground but never landed in Ireland. Now, the story of what happened with Hawker and Grieve in the Sopwith in spring 1919 could have been a book in its own right, and certainly, the shock. The distress of people literally around the world. This was the biggest news pretty much of the world for 2 weeks. To understand what happened there, it's an astonishing story. Nor were the Vickers team the second to make it off the ground. The second team were Martinsyde, actually, with Fred Raynham at the controls. Not talk about that either. So it became a race again between Vickers and Handley Page. And both teams had managed to get off the ground for test flights around Newfoundland, but only with light fuel loads. So who was going to be first off the ground? The huge Handley Page bomber with the four-person crew led by Admiral Mark Kerr in his 50s. You talk about shenanigans. I mean, the Brooklands boys learned who their friends were in this whole process, but first to make it off the ground, hoping that the next time they land will be in Ireland, was Alcock and Brown in the Vickers. And the story, I mean, they very, very nearly did not even make it off the ground and stay in the air. The story just of the takeoff.
Let's wander around to the front, because we're going to be talking about the pilots. We might as well be near the cockpit.
Let's do it.
And we also have to just give Lucky Jim a hello as we go past. Because pilots and crews are very superstitious chaps, and they won't go flying without a lucky charm.
And this wasn't a fun thing. The Black Cat mascots, the Lucky Charms, the yarn dolls, the Cupid dolls. This wasn't just a fun joke, that a tradition. As you say, aviators from the early days had an absolute cast iron belief that these would bring them good luck and might save their lives at a time when people were more open-minded perhaps than we are today. So actually, Lucky Jim here and Twinkle Toe, who was Ted Brown's mascot, which is in another museum, are really significant characters in the story anyway. Jack Alcock, by 1919, was one of the greatest pilots in the world. He wasn't flashy. He'd survived the war, so he must have been a good pilot, but he wasn't flashy, but he wasn't timid. He was just a terrific pilot, the most level-headed you could have found. Everyone loved him. He was just, I really, really, really wish I could have got a chance to meet him. But when you find out about what happened trying to get off the ground in Newfoundland, you realise it was only somebody with the skill that Jack Alcock had that meant that they got off the ground and lived to get into the air. They very nearly didn't. But then once they managed to get into the air and flew off over the cliffs of St. John's, heading for the open ocean, and what happened in the next 16 hours before they landed in Ireland is just the stuff of the greatest adventure stories ever written.
And you've done it very well. I thoroughly enjoyed it. But this is the thing. We think 8 hours across the Atlantic is interminable, even when we've got movies, someone bringing you drinks, and I'm looking up there going, that's not far off an economy seat. But you don't have to sit in an open cockpit flying through terrible weather, which kind of wasn't forecast because forecasting was a a hit and miss at the best of times on that sort of trip.
Nobody, the meteorologists did their best to understand what weather did at that sort of height above the Atlantic or any great ocean. And you can send balloons up, and they did, but the balloons couldn't go as high as the aircraft would fly. Nobody knew how even aerodynamics would necessarily work at the height that they would be flying. So there were some estimates which were largely wrong about what the weather would be like over the Atlantic, the speed of the wind, fog, and all of this. And they might have had an easy run, but they didn't. They hit everything that could possibly go wrong in 16 hours.
Because you've got, one of the first things that goes wrong is they have a radio on board to give position reports. That fails.
Correct.
They start climbing. Icing conditions are a lot worse than forecast. And icing's bad enough on a modern aircraft, but on something where you have no de-icing equipment, very little way of removing ice, but then ice getting into the pitos, the generators, stuff starts shutting down, and there's not this is a technical term, there's not a lot of stuff on here in the first place, so when what you do have stop working, you're in a lot of trouble.
You're in trouble. I mean, when you look at the size of the ailerons in this aircraft, these are huge control surfaces, all controlled by wires, by Alcock's arms, basically. When they froze solid, the hinges froze solid, they couldn't move.
So these froze
solid at one point. Luckily, the Vimy was a forgiving aircraft to fly, and so it still had rudder and elevators, so he could fly even though these had frozen. The only way to de-ice these aileron hinges was to descend as fast as possible, and hopefully the ice would melt.
And it
did, and that was fine. But you mentioned the ice into the pitot. Yeah. Again, not wanting to give too much away here, but there was a point when they hit a fog bank that they weren't expecting, and and this was the worst possible luck. Like, Jack Alcock could fly through fog. He was highly experienced, long-distance pilot, and he knew his bearings even when he couldn't see external cues in fog, as long as he had those one or two instruments that would help him, airspeed indicator, being a primary one. And when that failed just at that instant because it was jammed with ice, and he lost his bearings. And when he did not know the orientation of the aircraft, and he had no way of seeing any cues, visual cues, he could feel and he could see from the compasses that he'd fallen into a spiral dive. He was heading down for the ocean through cloud and couldn't pull out. All he had to hope was that he would come underneath the lower level of the cloud in time to see the ocean.
And they just about do, because they get incredibly close.
20 feet from the surface of the Atlantic, heading almost vertically down with the engines off when they came from the fog bank, 100 feet, maybe 50 feet. By the time he'd realised what his orientation was and pulled out of the dive, 20 feet, they both said later that they could hear the voice of the cheated ocean beneath them, and they could almost taste the salt. In fact, I think they probably could taste the salt spray on their lips. Pulled out, engines back on. Thank goodness they were Rolls-Royce Eagle engines, which sparked into life straight away, and levelled off. Climbed as fast as he could to get some separation, but 20 feet.
You say good old Rolls-Royce. Of course, one of the exhausts comes off early in the flight, so the noise level in this tiny cockpit gets.
It wasn't good when the exhaust exploded.
Understand.
And so there's a sound like a machine gun going on in Alcock's right ear. Then what's left of the exhaust starts glowing white hot and then crumples and slips off in the slipstream.
So that was on this side over here.
Yeah, it was on the starboard engine. Yeah. And then, so when they realised what had happened, that the engine was still all right, but it was just exhausting into the air, Alcock concentrated on right, what are the consequences of this? What do I need to do? Brown had less to do at that instant except to look over Alcock's shoulder and see where the flame that was now coming out of the open cylinders was playing onto. And it was playing onto one of the metal tensioning wires that holds the wings together. And it started glowing red hot.
So you've got lots of noise, you've got potentially melting, also in an aircraft covered, flames on an aircraft covered in highly flammable dope. Not ideal. Now,
not ideal.
We're not going to go into all aspects of it, but one of the stories that came out was the Ted Brown climbing out to get the generator clear of ice. That didn't happen, did it? Mainly because Ted's sitting over here.
The story was that you've got a petrol header tank which feeds the engines through gravity. So you've got a constant pressure, and the petrol passes through a sight glass so that you can see that fuel is flowing through into the engine. So it's a safety device to make sure that you haven't got a blockage, right?
That's the one, yeah.
So the sight glass needs to be checked periodically through the flight to make sure the engines are getting fuel. But because of the icing that we talked about earlier, that started getting covered in ice. And so it had to be chipped off by Brown because Alcock was flying. Now, the myth that started to develop from the 1950s, when a screenplay started to be written for a film about Alcock and Brown, it never came to anything, but the screenplay was written, and the guy who wrote the screenplay decided that the story wasn't dramatic enough in real life and invented this myth that Brown climbed up onto his seat and then climbed onto the fuselage and possibly along the wing to chip the ice off the flight glass. Now, my former colleagues at the Science Museum, and I've read the files, went to a great deal of trouble to disprove the myth and how he would have been decapitated if he'd gone anywhere near the places that the screenplay suggested he did. However, he did have to climb up onto the seat and then turn his back to the direction they were going and reach up with kind of one knee braced onto the fuselage. The thing is, you don't need to make up dramatic scenes. Now, there's another scene that you'll know, having read the book, about Arthur Whitten Brown in the First World War, and something that happened to him then, which is absolutely true, and which is so much more terrifying than wing walking a Vimy flying straight and level across the Atlantic. The truth is stranger and more terrifying than fiction. And I'll leave readers to find that spot in the book, but we need to remember the skill and bravery of pilots and observers in the First World War in aircraft a fraction of the size of these in the worst possible conditions.
So needless to say, they make it, but the story of their arrival in Ireland is fantastic. There's a little bit of farce thrown in as well. What is the reaction? Because, again, don't want to go too much into it. There was a lot of press over Harry Hawker's disappearance. Maybe he shows up again. Maybe he doesn't. Read the book. What happens when the news finally gets out that Alcock and Brown have made it in this very aircraft?
Well, it was the news of the world. The Atlantic had been hopped over, and Alcock and Brown had landed in Ireland, in the county of Galway, near the town of Clifton. The landing was difficult because what looked like a field from above turned out to be bogland, but it was a good enough landing. They walked away from it, so that was a good landing, right? Of course, they were in the middle of Clifton in County Galway. For the news to get out, luckily, they'd landed next to Clifton Marconi wireless station, so the news was able to be telegraphed out by wireless very quickly. And then it was a journey for them. I mean, they just had 16 hours in this epic journey across the Atlantic. It was a longer journey to get from Clifton to Galway, from Galway to Dublin, then across to Holyhead, and then to London Euston. And everywhere they went, from the smallest towns and villages to the capitals of Dublin and London, they were met by the biggest crowds, the most adoring crowds, the most excited crowds. They were heroes. They were reluctant heroes. They were a bit taken aback by all of this. But the world was delighted. And when they reached London, the scenes in Euston and the streets through to the Royal Aero Club were pandemonium.
When we had you on our other show, the 15-Minute Book Club, we do a thing where we throw a silly question at you, and mine was, why is this important when Lindbergh does it on his own and goes from New York to Paris a little bit later? For Lindbergh, this was vitally important to him, wasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, I would never take anything away from the achievement of Lindbergh in 1927. I mean, he flew like twice the distance on his own, the first solo flight. But he himself, when he landed in Paris, is said to have told onlookers, why all of this fuss? Alcock and Brown showed us the way. And Amelia Earhart, when she flew the Atlantic solo, also talked about Alcock and Brown's flight as being the most important in history. Amy Johnson, who flew to Australia in the aircraft
this very aircraft
above
up
our
here.
heads, also said she believed that Alcock and Brown's was the greatest flight and perhaps the least appreciated. So those aviators who followed in the wake of the Vickers Vimy remembered Alcock and Brown, but the public soon seemed to forget as time went on. And now, I would say, most people, if you ask who was first to fly the Atlantic, would say Lindbergh. So being able to bring the story back out from the shadows and into the spotlight, this great achievement of 1919, we fly across the Atlantic as if it's mundane or even something of a chore that we want to escape into our screens. But somebody had to go first. And it was those two guys in that.
David, thank you so much. And thank you to the staff of the Science Museum who've been valiantly trying to stay out of shot. They didn't need to do that, Aggie and everybody. You could have been in, listening in. I'm going to hand you your book. Give us the title.
The Big Hop, the first non-stop flight across the Atlantic Ocean and into the future. It's a great pleasure writing it as well.
It's been fabulous chatting. I thoroughly enjoyed it. This has only taken us... We started talking in June about doing this, so it's only been about 8 months of planning and coordination. But like I said, thank you to the team at the Science Museum for letting us play in the flight gallery here in the Science Museum of South Kensington for a couple hours. And we're going to have to do something else, because this has been a lot of fun. Whatever you have, if you're doing aviation next, we'll do some more. But David, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
The Big Hop, the first non-stop flight across the Atlantic and into the future by David Rooney, is out now. And in the description below, you can find links to our bookshop.org sites here in the UK and the US, where you can get David's book, support independent bookshops, David and us here at the Aviation Show with every purchase you make. The Science Museum in South Kensington, London is open daily from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. And for February half term, which runs from Saturday the 14th to Friday the 20th of February, the museum is opening early at 9 a.m. So book your tickets now at sciencemuseum.org.uk. And many thanks to Laura, Aggie and the rest of the team at the Science Museum for facilitating our visit. As you can see, we had a fantastic time. I'd like to say thanks to all of our fantastic supporters over on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the fun from just £3 a month, plus a bit of VAT, get your name in these very credits, and get all the episodes ad-free and early as soon as I get the edit finished. The Aviation Show is hosted and produced by Matt Bowe and is a Boney Abroad production.